Hi, and welcome back to the Health, Weight Loss, and Wellness Show. And today, our very special speaker is David Pope. David is a private counsellor specialising in bereavement, depression, and anxiety, and also runs a guided meditation podcast, which is amazing. I went in and stalked you a little bit with that. He is also passionate about sharing physical and cognitive techniques to deal with mental illness. Thank you so much for being here today. I've been really looking forward to having this conversation because I really feel like it's not spoken about enough and we have a little bit of a stigma around it. And I'm wrapped that you're here and that we are going to open up this conversation and try and normalize it somewhat.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me here. And yeah, it's not talked about enough, either mental illness or grief. There are various reasons for that, which we can get into. But yeah, there's definitely a stigma surrounding both, I think.
Yeah, and I really want to normalize the conversation because I feel like it's a very important conversation to have. And it can be the difference between, I feel like we shy away from it a lot. But if we lean into it and have more conversations around mental illness and grief and bereavement, then we can have a totally different experience than what we're having now or what we expect that we're going to have. But you've got a bit of a journey of how you actually got here to be in private practice. Do you want to share that with us?
Sure. Well, my story with mental illness began at around 6 years old at primary school, where there was this feeling of something not quite being right. And many teachers would pull me aside and say that I looked isolated, I looked alone, I looked withdrawn. And I think what those observations did is probably exacerbate that feeling of isolation. Very often I would find myself watching from the outside and watching what everyone else is doing, watching the kids play, watching, standing outside the classroom just before we went in and just observing people and feeling like a complete outsider. I always sort of had one best friend at school, but I was this awkward, pretty depressive kid. And what happened as time progressed is I was relentlessly bullied at school, both primary and secondary. So we're talking from the ages of 6 right through till 16, 17. I was in a lot of fights. The sense of isolation grew and grew as time went on. And the situation with me at school was very much, I had no interest in schoolwork whatsoever. My passions were music, English, and sport, and that was it.
Yeah.
And I was very able at sport. I was a key musician. I started learning different instruments from quite a young age. I used to spend hours locking myself away in my bedroom, just practicing and learning different things. Maybe that was a coping mechanism for my struggles. But the way I was kind of dealt with at school was, well, you don't want to study, so we're just going to leave you by the wayside. There was no one to come and say, look, I can see you're struggling. What can I do to help?
Mm.
My parents were great. I mean, they tried hard to help me. They got me the odd sort of tutor, extra tutoring, etc. But I just didn't have the type of brain to understand things like maths and geography and science. I didn't have that type of brain. I still don't. I'm very I can talk about the brain for hours and I can talk about many things for hours, but if you show me how something works, I can't process it.
Yeah.
Which is ironic because my father was the total opposite. He could build anything. So
Yeah.
work that out.
Yeah, it's your learning style. Yeah, it's one thing that we've all got. I'm auditory. So for me in school, I would always be told off for talking when I was just saying out loud what the problem was because I had to hear it, right? And so I used to get told off for that. And school's not geared for people that are auditory or kinesthetic sometimes too. Mm.
Yeah. And I think also the schools that I was at, they're quite sort of academically orientated schools. So I was really just, as I said, left to do nothing. I was just, I couldn't cope with it. Fast forward sort of into my late teens, my depression got worse and worse. And I'd say from the ages of 16 to about 23, I pretty much just stayed in my bedroom. I was still very keen on music, but I used to spend hours just doing nothing. And it's interesting. The interesting part about depression is that 8 or 9 hours can go by and you've done nothing.
Yeah.
And you think, hang on, what's happened here? You know, how come my day is gone and I've done nothing? But that is synonymous with depression. It's a feeling of just emptiness and numbness, and you can stare into space for endless amounts of time. And then at the age of 25, I got a double bereavement dropped on my lap. Both my parents passed away within a year of each other, both to cancer. And it was particularly grueling because, you know, I love my parents. I was very close to them. And it completely tore me apart. And it's amazing what you get through in life, but I did. I did seek grief counseling pretty much straight away. So I was very fortunate that I jumped on that pretty much immediately and had therapy for 2 years. I've pretty much had therapy for much of my life to deal with a lot of the struggles that I still go through. And as I said, what sort of began my mission to help people was it got to a point where it was either live or die. I had a choice. Either I had to try and help myself, or life was just not going to work. You know, I couldn't carry on with this suffering because the depression then became struggles with anxiety, which then became sort of struggles with past trauma, which then sort of manifested into really dark thoughts. So I was at a point, especially when I got into my 20s, where there was no choice. I had to find solutions. So that began an obsession, I would say, with self-development, self-improvement, growth, psychology, philosophy, you name it. And I just consumed myself with as much reading material and audible material, video material as I could. And I just found that I would spend so much of my time listening to individual stories, because that's really how you learn coping techniques. It's to listen to somebody else's story and how they got through their struggles. And this is the best way to educate yourself, because you're getting it from...
It's possible, doesn't it?
Yeah. You're getting it from the heart. You're getting a real life solution to an issue. And then as a result, I became a private counselor, because I felt that I've learned so much over a 20+ year period that you get to another point in one's life where you want to pay it forward. And, you know, when you heal others, you heal yourself, right?
Yeah.
And that's still true today, that when somebody is struggling, whether it's with grief, whether it's with depression, and you're helping that person, number one, it gets you out of your own head.
Yeah.
And two, it gives you that sense of completeness that we all seek.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's an amazing, I don't know if you say amazing, but what a journey that you've been on and what you've been through as well. You know, it question, I don't know whether you might not know the answer, but looking back now to that little boy who was standing on the outside looking in, what do you think he needed in that moment? What do you think that was?
So I revisit this concept quite frequently, and I would say that if I could revisit my childhood now, I would say to little David, what can I do to help? How can I be there for you?
Yeah.
What do you need? What's troubling you? Tell me about that. Tell me about your troubles.
Yeah.
So I think that's what I would say.
Yeah. So little David wanted to be heard, I guess, or understood, maybe.
So I feel that the younger version of myself just felt as though no one understood. Because even though I had a very loving family, they didn't get it because they weren't experiencing it.
Yeah.
There's a direct parallel with this to when people suffer loss. I come across this almost daily, that someone will lose a loved one and they just can't get that sense of validation from others. They can't get that support that they need.
Yeah.
And it's because if someone hasn't experienced loss, or they haven't experienced depression, or they haven't experienced anxiety, it's very hard to relate.
Yeah.
Very hard to have an understanding of what the sufferer is going through.
Yeah. 100% agree. And that's why when I say what I went through personally, is nothing like what you've gone through, but I had an emotional, stressful, traumatic moment in my life. And as a result, I ended up spiraling, not looking after myself, going into more stress and spiraling into illness that I had no idea it was coming, and end up with chronic fatigue. Now, from that experience, what I've actually learned in that time has made me a better therapist. And so I'm grateful that it happened, because I understand more, even to the point where, you're suffering chronic fatigue, you can't get up to feed yourself. And people will say, oh, they mean well, right? So I'll just go for a walk, you'll feel better. And I'm just in the moment, I'm like, it's not helpful. I'm like, I just want to punch you in the face, shut up. So I get what you're saying is, if you have not experienced that, there's therapists out there that doesn't have to experience that. You don't have to experience to know how to help with it. But I just feel like once you've experienced it on the level that you have, you're going to have this level of understanding of where people are. And I feel like that's probably the first phase that people need, is understanding. Yeah.
Yeah. Listen, there are specialists out there who obviously are very highly qualified to treat mental illness, and there are bereavement counselors out there who are fantastic counselors and are highly qualified. Personally, the people that I've been really inspired by are the people who've traveled the road.
Yeah.
And the other reason for that is because if you know that someone's gone through what you've gone through, or they're going through what you're going through, it enables you to relate. It enables you to reduce that sense of isolation.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is to do with that. If I think back to anything that's inspired me, well, what has really inspired me is the person and how I connect with that person.
Yeah.
And one is more likely to connect with someone if there's like a common denominator. If there's something that, oh, right, yeah, this person gets it. They get it.
Yeah.
Now, as I said, that's not to say that you have, as you say, you have to experience the struggle to be able to help people. Absolutely not. But from a personal point of view, you know, I've been particularly moved and helped by people who, as I said, are struggling with depression, and they'll talk about what they're going through. They'll talk about how they struggle to get out of bed, or they'll talk about how they managed to do X, Y, and Z and how it made them feel. You know, when something comes, as I said, something comes from the heart, it's very healing. Yeah.
Yeah, and I feel like that having that level of empathy and understanding, like you said, really helps people not feel isolated in those moments. And I think from time to time, sometimes there's people that have suffered with it for a very long time. And before we started, we were kind of talking about, you know, our what we're eating and our diet has an effect on that. But, you know, I would say in your situation, it's definitely environment, you know, that's played a part there. But also you trying to figure out, you know, maybe had a different way of things. Like if I always try to think, I think of people around me that can give me examples. And I know that my oldest son is the quiet introvert, you know, loves his own company in his own time and is the yes, no kind of answer. And then his younger brother is, you know, they're chalk and cheese. So they're completely opposite. So when I hear you talking about, you know, those times when you were at school feeling isolated, you know, like you didn't fit in, I think of my oldest son, where he was just this gentle, you know, the head of his time, I think, type of maturity, I guess, that didn't feel like he fit in. So as you were talking, that's why I asked that question. I'm like, what did that little boy want? You know, because I think as parents, we will often struggle, you know, people that are like us, it's easier to get along with.
Yeah.
But we've got people in our family that we want to get along better with, and we want to meet them where they are and have a meaningful relationship with. So for me, with my son, I want to have that meaningful relationship with him and meets him where he is. So for people out there that have got people in their family that are not like them, there's nothing wrong with them, but they're not like them, but they want to relate. They want to have that close relationship. Where would you say, where would we start with that?
Well, interestingly, one of the most common issues that I come across is, as I said, a lack of understanding and validation from family members and friends for people that are struggling with mental illness. And what it does is it exacerbates the mental illness because it just increases that sense of isolation, especially with friends, especially amongst sort of teenagers, for instance, where they might confide in a friend about how they're feeling. The friend will then betray that trust and talk about them behind their back. All these kind of things absolutely increase that suffering. They increase that sense of pain. And it is so common. So what I normally say to people in that situation is just be very, very careful about who you open up to. Make sure that you have established boundaries. Just be very selective. Be very selective about who you open up to. I know the message these days is reach out and seek help, and absolutely 100%. But be a little bit selective about, you know, who you do. Back to your question. I would say there are two approaches. So you can either adopt an approach where you're trying to advise and help and guide, or there's the other approach where you just hold space. Interestingly, this is synonymous with grief as well. So, for instance, if someone's lost a loved one, how can you help them in the early stages? Well, you can take round their favorite coffee. You can help them out with chores. You can take them a meal round. You can cook for them. You can do their gardening. All these kind of things are things that someone who's just lost a loved one, these are the things they really need. what people don't want to hear is time heals all wounds, and they're in a better place, and this is going to make you stronger. These are all no-nos.
Yeah.
What you need to do is just let them feel your presence. You're there for them. However they want you to be there, you're there for them. And it's very similar with someone who's...
Their terms is very important.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's very similar with, say, somebody who's struggling with anxiety or depression, that, you know, the people within their family, there's a good chance that they completely just do not relate at all. They haven't experienced it. No one they know has experienced it. So again, they can either try and help them on a physical or cognitive level by suggesting strategies that can help. But not everyone wants to be helped. They just want someone to be there. They just want to be able to vent.
Yeah.
You know, interestingly, on the majority of suicide hotlines, they're not allowed to advise.
Yeah.
They just have to listen.
Yeah.
So it's gauging where this person is at. Where is their head at? Now, you could say, look, let's go out for a run, or let's go out for a walk. And they could be in a space which is just, that is the last thing they want to do. And there's no way they're coming out on a walk.
Yeah.
So then you have to rethink and think, okay, that's not going to work. But there's a list of 50 other things that I can try. But I think you can gauge very quickly whether somebody's completely closed and shut off to wanting help. And if that's the case, then very often it's just listening.
Yeah.
And being there and validating, period.
So would it look like something like, say if somebody's, I know sometimes, you know, dealing with kids and teenagers, but I know sometimes people don't want the help. They don't want the advice. They don't want to hear another person saying, "Oh, try this or do that." So I guess it's, you know, when you've got somebody like that, what I'm hearing is, you know, meet them where they are and ask what it is that how you can support, and also, you know, being there and not pushing what your agenda, I guess, is the thing, is what I'm trying to say.
So what I would say is that, you know, very, very often, especially if it's your child, that's really struggling, then you're feeling their pain. You know, that this is something that is really hard for you to deal with as well.
Yeah. And
that's the whole thing, isn't it, about having children, that when you have a child, all their struggles are your struggles.
Yeah, you're desperate to help them feel better, and it's a helpless kind of situation where, you know, most parents don't have the skill. And I remember bringing my children up, I didn't have that skill. I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I probably made it 10 times worse.
I doubt it.
I tell them all the time that I mentally scarred them. They agree.
Yeah, I mean, it's a case of, you can only do what you can only do as a parent. All you can do is be there, try your best, you know, try and be the best parent that you know how. Because in the end, what else can one do? If your child is really struggling, it's not your fault. You know, you're doing the best you can. And it's so common for parents to struggle with this, to feel guilt, to feel that, you know, this is their fault. They could have done more. They could be doing more. The reality is, you're doing the best you can. You're being the loving, caring parent that you are. And in the end, sometimes we have painful journeys,
Yeah.
and life can be a painful journey, and we don't want our child to struggle. We don't want our child to have stress in their life, and we want them to try and learn from our mistakes, and we want to try and guide them as much as as much as we can. But in the end, they do have to live their life, and life is about painful lessons.
Yeah. And look, and I think sometimes one thing that I think we need to be careful of as well is when we're approaching a child and maybe want them to talk more or to be more engaged or to come out of their room, we can come across as critical, as not accepting, or and that could come across as you're not lovable, that there's something wrong with you, when really it's not. So sometimes it can be a fine line. So in that situation, I guess if I'm thinking about like what you said, in those situations, it would be better off being consistent and being encouraging, and I guess being consistent with your presence, checking in, how you're going, even if you're getting the yes, no, maybe kind of answers. And then I think, what about if, you're getting that kind of response from somebody who's really depressed, and you're getting not much verbal confirmation from them. Can you do things like, hey, we're going to catch up XYZ? Because some people are introverted, right? You don't want to just bounce on them. Like, I'm extroverted, to be introvert's nightmare. So I guess it would be I know with the introverts, you got to plan forward for them. Hey, I'm going to come over, and, next time we jump on the phone, let's talk about XYZ, and always check, is this a good time for you? So for somebody depressed, would that kind of strategy also work?
So there's a couple of things to unpack there. The first thing I would say is that knowledge is power. So when we educate ourselves more about mental illness, we're going to be of more help to people. So one of the most common things that I face as a counsellor is the lack of understanding about mental illness. So, but it's not just the lack of understanding. There's also, there are various reasons why families and friends are unsupportive. Maybe they perceive mental illness as a weakness. So if they have a child who has depression, their concern is how that looks, right? To their friends, maybe, and people outside their unit. So they perceive it as a weakness. They're going to try and cover it up. And how do you cover that up? You cover that up by not validating your child's struggles.
Yeah.
And there's so much damage done as a result of that, because I hear it all the time, the sort of rhetoric coming from family and friends, such as, you're a drama queen, you love attention, all those kind of sort of degrading comments, and they cut, and they really get to someone who's struggling, and it just intensifies that feeling of loneliness. There are other reasons why families don't help out, and that's because it is effort. It's a lot of work to support someone who's struggling. There's no question about it. It's not easy.
And you can be triggering yourself as well in those moments. It can be self-triggering, and so people can not want to face their own depression or anxiety or feelings of being isolated. So when they're confronted with that, can trigger them too.
That's a really good point. It's a really good point. And so many people carrying around repressed trauma. You know, anger, when you think about anger and the concept of anger, anger very often is repressed for most of your life because we don't have this ability to always express how we feel because we're living in a civilized society.
Yeah.
So if somebody is disrespectful or somebody's rude or somebody's inconsiderate or somebody's taking liberties, most of the time it's very hard to express how we feel just because we have to live within certain parameters in society. So I would agree with you 100% that very often we don't want to trigger ourselves because those emotions are too painful. We haven't dealt with them. We haven't properly dealt with our traumas.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's very, very common as well with both loss and with mental illness, that you bury things,
Yeah.
you bury your emotions, and even though they're buried, they're still within you.
Yeah.
And they have nowhere to go until one day, inevitably, everything does come out in the wash.
Yeah. The other thing that I wanted to really discuss with you too, I know we touched on it a little bit, was grief and death and dying. And I really would like to normalize that kind of conversation as well. And especially start having those kind of conversations with those that we love and care about. And so in those moments, when it comes to those moments, that you can have a totally different experience. And I want to use a colleague of mine as an example, who's actually on this show. He did a lot of work around grief and, you know, what to expect. His mother had cancer and she recently passed about 3 months ago. And so he did a lot of work around that. He didn't want to leave anything unsaid, anything left on the table, had the awkward conversations, and come to, there was, you know, certain things that still weren't said, right? And it's right up to the day before. And he just had this, because he kept at it and he did the work, he had this most amazing experience with his mother and his father over the, you know, the in her last days. And it was just the most beautiful experience that he could ever imagine. Everything that was said, he heard, is everything that he wanted to hear. And the experience that he had, because he did that work around grief and what to expect and, you know, have that conversation. And by the time that came, he was ready for it and had a great experience. Then when we look at his family who didn't do that kind of work, he's a therapist, right? So give them some credit there because he's a therapist, hadn't done the work, found that whole experience was just so traumatic, you know, and passing is normal. And even me thinking about it, because we don't talk about it, makes me feel anxious, right? Always had a fear of dying, which was my driver that pushed me, you know, because I had this fear of death. And I learned so much from him in that experience. And I'm like, I want his experience when it's turned for my parents. You know, I don't want the other experience. So how do we even go about that, right? How do we're through midlife, we're going to get a lot of this more and more. People are going to pass. It's normal and natural. How do we start having these conversations?
Well, again, similarly with when we're talking about mental illness struggles, it's a question of educating oneself and becoming familiar with the world of grief. And one thing I would say is that you can't really prepare yourself for the loss of a loved one. You can certainly raise your awareness. You can certainly familiarize yourself with the early stages of the grief process, the later stages of the grief process. There are so many different aspects of the grief process that you can definitely become mindful of.
Yeah.
But when you lose a parent or a sibling or a best friend, aunt and uncle, God forbid a child, nothing prepares you for that.
Yeah.
You can't take a course in grief. Yeah. But what I would say is that there are different coping mechanisms for different stages of grief. So in the early stages is all about that great line, which is grant me the serenity to accept the things I can't change, right?
I love that.
Yeah. What does that mean? So what that means is I can't control this. This has happened. I can't change it. Because when we lose a loved one, the first thing we try and gain is that sense of control. Because when the rug gets pulled and you feel like the universe is crashing, you go into flight mode, and your body as a coping mechanism starts to think, right, what can I control?
Yeah.
So paradoxically, what you can control is the fact that some things are beyond your control and there's nothing you can do about them. Yeah. So it's almost like that issue about surrender, that I'm not happy this has happened and I'm not bowing down to this, but actually there's nothing I can do. I've got to surrender to this.
Yeah.
I think it's very, very common for people to have expectations of themselves in the early stages of grief. So some people can't grieve. Some people struggle to grieve. They struggle to shed tears. Some people...
I've heard of that too. And people feel like there's something wrong with them because they're not crying.
Yeah. And it's absolutely not the case. And there are many things to unpack as to why that's going on. But grief has no time limit and it has no rules. There's no set way to grieve.
Yeah.
And some people sob uncontrollably for months, years. You know, again, you're not prepared for this. So you will just react in whatever way you react. And however you grieve is fine. However you grieve is how you grieve.
Yeah.
But it's just releasing expectations. A lot of people struggle with the fact that they're not shedding tears or that they're not feeling this sense of trauma. But actually you need to let go of those expectations.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And I remember my friend saying that. He was repeating that over and over, that it's all out of his control. And I think that's very good advice, not just for grief, but for a lot of things in life, really, is when we have expectations on anything and anyone, and it's a tough one to talk about, tough to talk about, but it's to get, I would say, because if we don't have expectations on people or things or whatever it is we're doing, rather than be in the moment with whatever it is and accepting what will come, what will become. Some things are out of our control. A lot of the time we struggle with that concept because we're like, well, you should have certain expectations on things. Wouldn't you? You would expect that you get in your car and it starts, and you expect that you're going to buy something and it works. Sure. But, I think it more means having an attachment to the outcome rather, that goes with that expectation, doesn't it?
Yeah. One coping strategy, which I would say is great for depression or anxiety, is a gratitude strategy. So a couple of interesting takes on gratitude is that if you don't have those expectations, then your sense of appreciation for things will really increase. So for example, if you go to start your car and it starts, which it does most of the time, hopefully, you don't really appreciate it because you have an automatic expectation that car's going to start. But what if you didn't?
Mm.
So if we release all expectations, literally from the minute we get up in the morning, everything that works and everything that goes well during your day will be a bonus.
Yeah.
Because you don't have that expectation. So that's a great way to connect with gratitude. And another thing I really like about a gratitude approach is when you sort of go into a shop and just buy a sandwich or whatever you buy, is to maybe think about the whole process that's gone into getting that product to you. When you become mindful of just how hard people out there are working to get the things that you need to enable you to live your life and survive, that's another nice strategy to have, just to be more aware of the fact that we are all really one consciousness. Without everyone working together synonymously in this world, nothing would get done.
That's so true, isn't it?
Yeah.
So true when you look at it that way, that when you think about it like that. Yes, epiphany moment.
Going back to the whole idea of processing loss, obviously there are going to be people out there who are at various stages in with their loss, because there are different things you can do for different stages, as I said. And I know one thing that I used to like doing to remember my parents was just to write a letter. I would write a letter perhaps on Father's Day or Mother's Day, or if I saw something that reminded me of my folks or heard something, and just say, dear Dad, dear Mum, miss you so much. I can't believe it's been so long. You meant the world to me. So doing something like that is really nice to connect you with whoever you've lost. Lighting a candle has a metaphorical meaning as well, in that, the world of grief can be very dark. And when you light a candle, you're not only bringing light into the room, but it's into your heart as well. And it's your way of connecting with who you've lost. To maybe have some sort of memory box or memorabilia box of things that your loved ones had, photographs, collages of photographs, anything that can just give you that sense of them will just give you that tiny bit of comfort. It doesn't take the grief away, but when you're going through a grief process, it's trying to do things that are just going to take the edge off.
Yeah.
So yeah, there are definitely, various other things you can do as well, but I found that those are particularly nice things to do.
Yeah, they sound lovely. And as you were saying that, I was imagining, going through that kind of process. I'm lucky my parents are still with us, but I imagined going through that process for my grandparents and other people that we've lost. And that's really nice. Like, my grandmother's ring that I wear, that I often think about her. And it reminds me of her, little things remind you of them. And I guess for me, I like to celebrate that and talk that out loud. That's how I deal with it. And like she used to always make me, shake the clothes in the dryer because I just throw them all in. And so I throw them in and then I'm like, yes, Nan, I pull them out and I shake them and I put them back in. So, I think I just incorporate little things like that in my day that reminds me of them, the way my grandfather buttered the toast and, he used to get the end of the knife and bang it into the toast and flatten it. I don't know why he did that, but he did that. And he used to be the cook, so he would cook the cakes and stuff like that. So, and steal our roast potatoes. So we kind of have those jokes in the family where we keep their memory alive of that as well. Interesting, my dad he'll celebrate the day, your grandfather's been dead 10 years ago today, or 15 years ago today, or something like that. And I'm like, I don't know what to say. Happy death day, like what do you want me to say, Dad? We're celebrating the day they pass it around us, like he's the dates person, where I'm more the, we all do it in different ways, right? So I'm more the little things that remind you of them. I like to go, oh, remember this, where he will be like, it's been 4 years and 3 days and 59 minutes.
Yes. Everyone sort of, grief is very personal. Everyone reacts differently. Everyone grieves differently. It is sometimes challenging for people to know what to say to someone who's lost a loved one. There are, as I mentioned right at the beginning, I think there are sort of no-nos.
Yeah.
And I even know of people who have struggled when somebody has said, I'm so sorry for your loss. Even though I personally think that's a nice thing to say, and I think there's nothing wrong with that, but some people who've lost a loved one don't want to hear that because they're thinking, well, you're sorry. How do you think I feel? So it is very hard to get it right sometimes, but I would say that, again, whatever stage they're at is quite key to how best to interact. So as I said, if it's in the very early stages, they're going to be in the shock and denial stage. They're going to be in their head's going to be all over the place. So that's a time when, for instance, you want to make sure that they're keeping hydrated, that they're eating properly. One of the biggest challenges in the early stages of grief is you totally forget about your health. You totally forget about your physical health.
Yeah.
Because you're trying to get to grips with this trauma. So I was very lucky that I had people around me who made sure I ate. Because the last thing you want to do is add to your problems and start getting ill. So this is one thing that's really overlooked, is if you want to help somebody, as I said, cook them a meal, or make sure they're drinking plenty of water. But again, it always goes back to the same thing, doesn't it? It goes back to if we all educate ourselves on the right things to say, the wrong things to say, the techniques that work, the techniques that don't work, the advice that works, the advice that doesn't work, we can all help each other more. And that is one thing that I do love about social media, that you could just hear one thing and it could change your whole day. You could be on a high just from hearing one thing, because everything is perception. Everything is how we perceive things. If somebody can change your perception towards something, or you can change your own perception, then it can make a dramatic impact on your life.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, sometimes people, like you said, can feel very isolated and, jump into the social media and then feel connected in some way. And with everything that's been going on, people can feel even more isolated. And I know for some people, they would rather connect over social introverts like that. They like to connect over the internet. And I feel like that that's how they like to do it. We should allow that to be normal as well. So I really like the fact that we're having this conversation, we're talking about these things, which I just feel like it's not talked enough about. We kind of all talk about the nice fluffy stuff, and I feel like if we talk about these things more, we have these conversations, we start thinking about these things, we may notice somebody else or know somebody that's going through grief, or you've gone through it yourself, or somebody that's struggling with mental illness. Now you have a little bit more in your toolbox, right? Now you have a little bit more information. Look, I feel like I've got so much out of this chat, like so much insight, especially with what you've gone through. I can tell that there's a real deep understanding and knowledge behind what you're saying. So I appreciate that. I really thank you for that.
Mm.
Because it helps my family. We often will go to joking, right? So we'll joke around
Yes.
these things when somebody may want something a little bit more or a little bit deeper. So it really helps me to step back and go, okay, in that moment when we're joking with my dad, checking in, and how are you going? How are you feeling about it? Are you missing them? And having those, because he's got one left, right? He's got one family member left, and he might be thinking about his own mortality, as that anniversary comes around, and we all poke fun at him, right? We all poke fun at each other. So it's kind of an Australian thing as well. So it really helps me to step back and go, okay, so, maybe he's mentioning it because he wants to have that open conversation. So now that we've talked about this, now that's helped me evolve. So I'm hoping those listening at home, that you've been writing these things down in your journal, and maybe there's something that you can pop in your promise jar right now, and that might be being more observant of the people around you and trying to be in tune of where you think they are. And if you notice somebody a little bit distant or withdrawn, that you take the time to go and give them your time and consistency. That if somebody's grieving, that you can ask them, how can I help you? How can I support you in this moment? What do you need? Rather than what I want to give. So I hope that through this conversation, it's going to ripple this knowledge out to all those that are listening, and then somebody out there is going to do something for somebody else, and then when they see someone else experiencing the same thing, they'll go and do it, because they'll go, oh, that was nice for me. So this is the hope for the show, really, as a whole, but especially for these kind of conversations that we just do not have often enough. So thank you so much for your time today, for sharing your knowledge, and for giving us this deep, rich understanding of grief and mental illness.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed the conversation, Jodie. And as I said, it's these sorts of conversations that will no doubt help people out there. And that's really what this is all about.
Yep.
When you feel that someone else is benefiting, or could even save a life today. I mean, how you can't really get better than that, can you? And that's why we do what we do. So it gives me a great sense of appreciation that your platform as well facilitates that.
Yeah, thank you. And you have got something that you want to gift to us. Well, it's available out there, but I wanted to bring it in here where people can access you and know where to find you. So tell us about that.
Sure. So my website is healyourgrief.co.uk. Everything can be found on there. If you are struggling, whether it's with depression or anxiety or trauma, or whether if you suffered a bereavement, I offer an initial chat free of charge just to see if it's something that you're interested in. I also have comprised a course, an online course for depression sufferers, which is called Depression: A New Hope. And that's also available on my website, which gives you 20 techniques and strategies to deal with depression.
Perfect.
And I also have a podcast, which is a guided meditation podcast. Meditation is something that I've done my whole life and has really helped. And that's also, the link is also on my website for that as well.
Yeah, and we'll make sure that we have all of those links on your speakers page for the event. Now, to access that, you need to make sure that you're registered. So if you are listening to this on YouTube and on Facebook, there'll be a link in the description for you to register. And once you register, we send out the email to all the each of the episodes, but it also walks you through how you can get the episodes and watch them on demand. And if there's anybody out there that's struggling and needs some help, there's also I know here in Australia we have Helpline, Grief Line, and I would say that you would have that in your country as well. So Google that, but also know that you are lovable and you are loved, and there's people out there that really care. So I would love to leave that with that, and I will see you in the next episode tomorrow. Thanks again, David. I really loved this conversation, and I hope we have lots more like it.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks, David. Bye.